I think Bitcoin hasn't found its perfect wealth creation moment, particularly because all of our sats are basically being burned to be minting these things, but also from just the dynamic of how fair launches for runes work. So all of those sats suddenly get spent. Now, there are ways to create value on chain, or at least have value flow into the chain, whether it's net newcomers, or you can have something as simple as a centralized exchange listing, which then moves the asset's price of, dog or pups or Billy by a factor of 5 to 10x. And what happens then? Then you finally have this implosion of meme coin millionaires on Bitcoin.
Welcome back to Bitcoin Season 2. I have FarmerJoe on today. If you're into ordinals, you know who he is. If you're not in ordinals, he's kind of a prominent Bitcoin investor analyst. I'll let him intro himself, but we're going to talk about the PUPS token. We're going to talk about runes. We're going to talk about emerging Bitcoin programmability layers like Arch, and overall, what do Bitcoin and Bitcoin assets look like after 100K? So welcome to Bitcoin Season 2, FarmerJoe. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Charlie. I know we know each other from, I guess, early ordinal days. Basically as the origin story of ordinals Twitter as a subsector of CT.
Yeah, ordinal. There you got CT, and then Bitcoin Twitter as a subset of that, and ordinals Twitter as this like weird offshoot from both. It's kind of a funny path that you take. But okay, so I said I called you an investor or an analyst. Like, what do you describe yourself as?
I think at this point it's I don't know. I guess I just do a lot. I'll tell you what I like doing. I'll put it that way, and then I think the audience can basically make their own conclusion as like what I do, because I guess everything at the end of the day blends very closely together. So, I'd say I started in the Bitcoin space primarily because it was a net new ecosystem on the biggest blockchain on the world. And so it just made sense for me that if users are here, there's going to be more things that come about from it. So I started in like the EVM side of things on, I would say, just after DeFi summer, more along the lines of Ethereum scaling days. So use some of the first L2s like Polygon and some of the other L1s that were focused on scaling with EVM. But I think, what I do on the Bitcoin side started off as, I guess, from things that I enjoyed doing on other chains, which is trading assets. And I was never an NFT trader, but I became an early ordinals trader, and it made sense that, just followed good founders that are going to be around for a full bull run, good teams, good communities, good vibes. And that kind of formed exactly what I was holding. So it started with ordinals. Then I guess it started as a meme coin founder by accident. And then, along the way, what I really, thought was appropriate was I was always talking to some of these early builders, whatever they were building, whether it's marketplaces, whether it's NFT projects or ordinals projects. And I was just having some fun angel investing into early teams and early builders that I thought were, focused on a very particular problem that I had. And I think that's been my philosophy for backing good teams. So, I have angel checked into products like Xverse, teams like Satflow, smart contract layers like Arch, primarily because, I think they solve very key problem points that I had is let's bring something that Bitcoin doesn't necessarily have today. Also, Liquidium is there. And, I'm basically the maximalist user, pro user of all of these products that I touch. And so, over time, happy to help these teams build better products, whether it's just from feedback, whether it's testing new features. And so I guess that kind of comes to ordinals, meme coin founder by accident, will not ever have an ordinals collection. Do not want to do that. So hopefully I don't become one by accident. I guess angel investor, strategic investor of some sort in the Bitcoin ordinals runes ecosystem. So around the encompassing DeFi sector that is going to come thereafter is what kind of my thinking there really is. And then I guess the last part is more recently, like, I guess partially a meme coin trader, because now I'm holding a bunch of these Bitcoin meme coins. Some of them down bad, some of them, have done reasonably well, but I think the upside for these things is in a trajectory that well exceeds 10x, which, to me is it allows me just to embrace the volatility. I could be down 50% at any given point. It's all about holding through some of the volatility cycles that these things will have as they kind of shake themselves out.
So you've got an intern. Tell me about your is this guy actually your intern, or is this like an alt? I've talked to somebody who told me that he's your intern. I was like, yeah, sure. I mean, nobody else has claimed that title yet.
There is a real intern. I think there's been like a few actually. So the first intern was I never really called him an intern because we would just bounce off ideas, and he was also in trenches. It was this guy named Fresh. Awesome guy. He's gone out to do amazing things for himself as a trader. So I communicate less and less with him. But the FarmerJoe intern account is actually one of my friends, IRL friends, quite frankly. That was Bitcoin curious, or ordinals curious, and meme coin curious. As you can see, there's been moments of time where the intern account somewhat dies for a period of 3 months.
Yeah, but it's back right now. I was like scrolling through Twitter this past week, and it's back. So
it hasn't been back in the last 7 days. So I think the intern really likes more of the bull market vibes when things feel right.
Yeah.
So my conviction doesn't necessarily align with maybe their conviction at times. But look, it is genuinely a real person. That's not me. I have no control over the account.
Well, I love it. A little bit of the FarmerJoe lore. I feel like having an intern is quite the sign of a bull market, whether or not they themselves feel that this week it's a bull market or not. I mean, we're sitting at 90K. Yeah, it's down from 99, but I'm gonna throw this question back at you. I feel like there's a great place to start out. Like, we're in a bull market, but it doesn't, the vibes are kind of weird. We are 40% above the previous cycle's all-time high. We are by definition in a bull market, but it feels really weird. Like, where do you think we are in this cycle? Like, where's your head at? How do you think about the current state of the market?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think no bull market has vibes that are immaculate 24/7. It's kind of a spiraling cycle of we're so back to it's over, but every time we reach the it's all over mark, it's still higher than last week's price. And so we continuously go through this loop of sentiment changes on a dime. I think in a bear market, it ends up shifting maybe like on a monthly basis or on a 3-week period basis, broadly speaking. More recently, it feels like it's every like 3 or 4 days that we go from it's back to it's all over sentiment. But I think, looking back at it, it's exactly how it was in past cycles, or the last one that I was involved in, where sentiment is volatile. And, at the end of the day, just zoom out a little bit, at least from a 30-day mark. And that's how kind of I perceive things to be. I think generally speaking, we're probably in like a very early stage of a euphoric bull run. I think there's a lot of positive trajectory, just from like an events catalyst perspective and an attention catalyst perspective. I think there's two really interesting, I would say, events that I'm kind of like looking forward to. And it's actually not OpCat. It's actually one being the FTX distributions. Everyone has been saying they're coming soon, and it feels like they were supposed to come last month. They're supposed to come this month. It was supposed to come December. But I think officially it's looking like early next year. And that's a massive stimulus package across the board, whether it gets allocated to altcoins, meme coins, or some of the major L1 tokens. I don't necessarily know. But, just generally price target is higher on most things. I think that's very healthy. Capital will come back into the ecosystem and primarily stay on chain, I hope, which seems to be where most of the edge is coming from as of late. And then the other one I think is really just around the Trump presidency. His inauguration is going to be in January. I think there's going to be a lot more talk about crypto regulation being, broadly favorable, given everyone who he is appointed. And then, the Bitcoin strategic reserve, I think that's going to be the speculative question mark that may not necessarily be priced into this cycle, but it will massively, affect the price to go higher as people anticipate he will make some pretty radical moves, given the fact that he's probably, or, I think most people know that he's not running for election next one. I don't even think it's possible based on the US rules.
Yeah, you can't run a third time unless you're FDR 1940s. Yeah.
You can't, yeah, exactly. So you can't run a third time. So, I think he's got 4 years to make some pretty radical moves. And I think they'll be pretty favorable crypto moves. So, if we just slice that into, where I'm thinking most of the action will come from, probably in the first 2 years. So we have this really nice window of higher for longer for at least a year is my estimate. How high? I have no idea. But, I think as long as there's not necessarily too much systemic risk, and it doesn't feel that way with centralized exchanges or some of these like CeFi products that no longer exist, it feels generally more healthy from a black swan event basis relative to the last cycle, which got a little crazy.
Bitcoin Season 2 is brought to you by Botanix. Botanix Labs is pioneering a new direction for DeFi with the first EVM L2 running on Bitcoin that's built to be forward secure, decentralized, and share gas fees generated by the network with users. See the future of DeFi at Botanix, botanixlabs.xyz. So that leads me into I think you're one of the best voices to talk about what the landscape of Bitcoin assets looks like, because you're talking about just the secular Bitcoin cycle and powering, normal crypto cycle. But what is unique this time around is we have this whole asset class, a very rich asset class of assets on Bitcoin. And you've had some tweets which put a finger in the wind to say $200 billion. That's like a kind of a guiding light for how big the overall market cap of these assets could be, I assume, in the near future. What does this mean? Talk me through this like talking point of yours. Like, what are these assets? Why $200 billion?
Sure. So, obviously these are like parity to other chain types of numbers. And of course, those chains had multiple cycles to accrue the value. So it maybe doesn't happen in a single cycle because that will take a huge amount of believers spending their sats into something as silly as meme coins. So still generally bullish on meme coins. Just it does take quite a lot of capital to move that. So other chains like Solana and Ethereum have about 6 to 7% of their market caps reflected in these assets in terms of just market sizing. So from like a TAM perspective, that kind of puts the number at, I would say probably closer to about 120 to 150 billion, but you gotta stretch it a little bit. It's Bitcoin.
Yeah, you've got to get people like paying attention. And as with all things in crypto, like your high targets are never high enough, and your low targets are never low enough. This is just the back and forth perennial cycle. Let's differentiate between the landscape of tokens and NFTs or inscriptions on Bitcoin. Do you think differently about these asset classes? I assume the answer is yes, but I kind of want to hear you talk about how you differentiate between where do the tokens on Bitcoin go, and maybe where do I would say the cultural collector items such as ordinals and inscriptions go on Bitcoin?
So I think I have maybe a view that the ordinals people may find unfavorable to their bags, and it's
let's hear this. I really want to hear this.
Yeah, I think this view has slightly evolved, and I'm a massive, I guess, ordinals whale on a lot of these things. So if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. But I'm starting to think a little bit more critically about this. So, for example, in the past, the only way that you could join a tokenized community was through a PFP collection. And so more recently, that narrative has actually been spun around, where meme coins are now tokenized communities. And so what is the real, I guess, driving factor to be joining some of these PFP collections? I think the argument for some of these top PFP communities and ordinals communities is really diminished now that we have tokenized communities which are fungible. And that's not necessarily a great thing for PFPs. Now, the counter argument to that is, from a artistic perspective, from a display perspective, I can't necessarily be, sharing, or it wouldn't necessarily be normal for someone to say, hey, look, I'm a dog whale. I have $500,000 of dog. Look at me, but you can do that with a PFP. So the counter argument is, humans will always want Grail assets. PFPs are the digital Rolexes of this generation. And what better to do it if you've made a substantial amount of wealth in the Bitcoin sphere than to do it with a Bitcoin focused PFP collection. In a similar way, we don't necessarily see people that have made it on Bitcoin meme coins or the Bitcoin ecosystem or Bitcoin in general to say, hey, look, I've made it off of Bitcoin. I'm rocking a CryptoPunk. And so what is that collection going to be? Is it going to be the Bitcoin puppets? Is it going to be node monks? Is it going to be something more premium feeling like the Bitcoin shrooms, which are founderless and arguably the most OG storytelling collection of all time? I'm still very much biased towards Bitcoin shrooms because I'm a large holder, and I just think that the story of them being out there and the founder just being gone forever is one that is, broadly de-risked. There is no founder risk, and I prefer things without a founder risk element to them. They're the purest form, and so I think both. I still think both can do very well. I just think that the Bitcoin ecosystem needs to be so stepping back a little bit, I view every single blockchain almost like a country with its own regulatory policy and its own dynamics. The Solana community or the Solana culture is very much like, oh, you can turn one soul on a dream is really the philosophy over there. And so you can turn one soul into millions of dollars, if you parlay trade all in on these meme coins over and over again, and you find some consistent edge. Ethereum had its wealth creation event with DeFi and all the capital that came about into the ecosystem. And I think Bitcoin hasn't found its perfect wealth creation moment, particularly because all of our sats are basically being burned to be minting these things, not only from founders, selling the collections to us, sometimes at very high prices, but also from just the dynamic of how fair launches for runes work. So all of those sats suddenly get spent, and there isn't necessarily a liquidity pool to then further create value. Now, there are ways to create value on chain, or at least have value flow into the chain, whether it's net newcomers finding the right or being persuaded by economic opportunities on the chain itself. Or you can have something as simple as a centralized exchange listing, which then moves the asset's price of, dog or pups or Billy by a factor of 5 to 10x. And what happens then? Then you finally have this implosion of meme coin millionaires on Bitcoin. And they have these newly fresh sats that they, maybe never realized that they could attain. And I think those types of events cause the flywheel to come back into these digital Rolexes.
I think we've shared similar takes, which is like the marginal buyer of these Veblen goods, of these high value luxury assets, are typically people who become wealthy from the ecosystem. And so, I sometimes we see people say, "Oh, I just want to be an art collector, and I don't really want to do meme coins." And you don't have to, but like as not, the marginal buyer of the higher priced assets on Bitcoin will probably come from people who have become wealthy and rich newly in the Bitcoin ecosystem, probably from meme coins, if they do generate this massive wealth generation event. As you mentioned, you talked about the Solana bridge and the Solana-Bitcoin link, and I think this is one of the most interesting events that we saw over the past year and a half, which is people, you being one of the, I would say, pioneers of this, taking an asset on Bitcoin, coordinating a bridge to Solana so that the Jeets over on Solana can trade it in a much more seamless, familiar way. I want to kind of talk about this. You were one of the first people to do this. I believe, was it the multi-bit bridge originally?
Correct, it was.
Yeah. Why did you do this? This was like mid 2013. Like, why did you do this? How did it work? And do you think it was successful? These are kind of rhetorical, but I want to throw those questions at you.
So this happened around February or so of this year. So about 8 or 9 months ago. I think the concept of wrapping assets is not necessarily a new concept. I think WBTC basically did this as a first mover that has worked out successfully for people on Ethereum. And so I was looking at like all of these L2s, and they didn't really have any like trustless Bitcoin. And I'm just like, well, meme coins can either go to these L2s, which are just in most cases, just Ethereum side or Ethereum rollups, or Polygon side chains, whatever you want to call them. There's a lot of formulas that you can go to market with, but they don't necessarily have a huge amount of users. And so, if we're just going to go down to the path of we're just going to call any other L1 with a roll up to Ethereum or another chain of Bitcoin L2, I just had this random thought. I'm like, well, why don't we just make Solana the Bitcoin L2? Like it's the fastest blockchain and has the most users. It just makes sense for assets to trade on the highest performance layer there is, which is right now Solana. And I was just fascinated with Toli. He's the founder of Solana, or one of the co-founders, I believe. He always had this obsession of making Solana like the fastest blockchain for, I would say, efficient market hypothesis to play its course. So information will flow at light speed, at light speed. And so we need a blockchain that can work at effectively light speed, or at least the speed of the internet. Obviously, Solana is trying to basically, crack the code and make it work faster than the internet, which would be quite revolutionary. But I think, broadly speaking, it was successful. I think it takes someone with a little bit of understanding of DeFi and AMMs and how much liquidity is needed on another chain. Once you're wrapping assets, then you have liquidity fragmentation. So, PUPS didn't necessarily go to 7 chains at once. It just went to Solana. It had a huge amount of fees accruing to those who were providing liquidity, which then created this like positive flywheel of people saying, oh, look, like I can hold 50% SOL and 50% PUPS, and I'm earning like 400, 500% APRs every single like day is 1.5% up. 30 days, that's 40% on real fees, which are accruing to the LPs themselves. As someone who used to play in the liquidity provisioning game, that was the place where I saw the opportunity to unlock the most amount of yield for LPs of PUPS. Myself, of course, being one of them. And then, I think it worked out pretty successfully. I think it opened up distribution of Bitcoin native assets to other chains. So one, I think there was friction points in going from Sol or Ethereum to Bitcoin. People needed to download a separate wallet. My favorite is Xverse, of course, but that means you have to find a way how to buy Bitcoin. Okay, so you can use like ThorSwap, you can use Magic Eden's built-in swap mechanism, you can deposit your SOL into a centralized exchange, then pay a fee from trading to get back into Bitcoin, but then you have to deposit it into your Bitcoin. Look, that is far too many steps for the average degen to want to embrace, specifically just to buy a token. And when you're trading these high velocity meme coins, you want to be buying them in the next, like ideally 2 or 3 minutes. And the only way to do that is just to bring them into the ecosystem that they're most familiar with, which, recently has been Solana.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who look at PUPS, the token, we're gonna talk a bit about PUPS now. They just see, oh, it's I guess it's affiliated with Bitcoin Puppets, and they don't know. And I think a lot of people maybe who've made it this far on the podcast who aren't as like dialed into the Bitcoin ecosystem, especially not the ordinals and runes ecosystem, aren't aware of the fun storied history of PUPS. I think this is one of the more funny like paths that we've seen any token take in the past like few years. Can you try to package for me in maybe like 5 minutes, like how did PUPS get to where it is now? Like, what is it, the second or third largest rune? I don't know what the particular ranking is, but top 3 runes.
It's the second largest rune right now. So it's actually a really funny story. I was a part of the original Bitcoin Puppets community, which was the Genesis art collection called Opium. And I just saw them memeing organically, and it felt like a very Miladies mixed with MFR type vibes is how I explained it to everyone. And when I did that, they're just like, okay, I kind of see what you're saying. And it was just a really fun place to be. The Discord was called The Shed, and there was just a bunch of people making art and memes and just comedy nonstop all day long, all night long. And when BRC20 tokens originally launched, I'm just like, okay, cool. I was in the Discord and I'm like, so we have this like medic energy and this meme community. Should we launch a token together? And so you can probably pull it up if just you Control F in the Discord, it might still be there. But it was just like, okay, what do we call this token? There was a couple of ideas, and we settled on like PUPS, and then we're just like, okay, next step, what do we need to do? All right, what is a token supply? And the original Genesis collection had 777, so we're just like, oh, why don't we do like 7,777, 777, just for the memetics. And I think, and then some people minted it. The community was definitely minting out, and it kind of stalled at about 30 some odd % after the first like day or two. And I'm just like, okay, well, what do I really need to do to make this, one, mint out, but two, it doesn't seem like anyone wants to be paying for it. And then I'm just like, okay, so I phoned up my friends at Ordinal's Wallet, Harry. He's a dev there. And I'm just like, so I was thinking about this idea. I really like how Bonk airdropped to basically every single Solana holder user Bonk tokens. I'm like, why don't we just do something similar? Can this be done? And he's just like, well, yeah, we would have to basically, we would have to make, 1,500 plus UTXOs, but, overall, it absolutely can be done. Let me see what I can do. And it took about like 2 or 3 days or whatever it is to put this together. And so I think it still remains to be the first ordinal / runes asset that was airdropped as a fungible, as like the origin story. And we airdropped about like 23% of the supply to 1,500 plus holders. It was some of the more like OG collections, early inscriptions. I think it was like some of the sub 10K ones. It was the Pixel Pepes. It was the Opium Group. And finally, that got to like 70 some odd percent. And then the rest is history. It just ended up minting out. But for a period of basically, I want to say this was April of last year, it was semi-trading. Like it was at like a 10 mil market cap at its kind of first peak. And then I think everyone just kind of forgot it existed. But I'm like, okay, cool. Like during this time, I'm like, I think a meme coin needs to have its own website. I think a meme coin needs to have its own Twitter profile. And I'm not a meme coin expert. I've never touched meme coins prior to this. So I'm learning on the fly, like asking people that, understand meme coins and like, what does a meme coin really need to have to feel like a meme coin? They're just like, it needs to have like its own side Twitter groups. It needs to have its own Telegram group. And I'm like, okay, so we started putting things together with a bunch of, I guess, early holders. Some of them ended up selling along the way, which is fine. Some of them are still very much involved and embracing the community. So that was like phase one. So that's the BRC20 story. And then when Runes came out, I'm like, well, I really like this Casey guy. And Runes definitely seem like an improvement in the fungible side of things. But I have a problem here. There's this new community of Bitcoin puppets, and it's a 10K plus one collection that, some of them have embraced this as like the community token, and some of them haven't necessarily embraced it. So I'm like, okay, well, this kind of gives us a pretty nice opportunity to say, look, like we're going to be migrating to the Runes token standard. And so about 23% of new supply ended up, diluting the prior holders. But on the plus side, you have this army of Bitcoin puppets, which suddenly got 23% of the supply. And they just championed it from start to finish after that point. So we airdropped this pre-Runes ordinal called Rune PUPS to each and every one of the Genesis art collection holders as well as a 10K plus one. So it was about an 11K airdrop at the halvening block, etched the actual rune itself, fixed the kind of the unit bias. So no longer 7.7 million tokens, but 1 billion supply, which still feels inadequate. Everyone's just like, we should have added 1 or 2 more zeros to make this even more mimetic. But look, we can't change this. We're not going to another new token standard. And after that, it was really just figuring out the how do we even migrate from a BRC20 token to a rune? How do we make it fairly secure? So, luckily there was teams like OrdKit, which built tooling, which built the adequate amount of security around it, built the wallet support to claim your runes and burn quote unquote burn your BRC20 by sending them to Satoshi, which is now the biggest PUPS holder, both on the rune PUPS side of things, because the unclaimed pre-rune ordinal side of things was just sent to him. And so he's like an overarching god here because he owns the most amount of BRC20 tokens and the most amount of PUPS tokens. So if one day his wallet becomes active, then look, I mean, they could be.
But so maybe Satoshi isn't coin control, so Satoshi might accidentally burn those tokens too. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. That's also a possibility. So long story short, we ended up migrating the full supply with a cutoff point, with a deadline. And here we are today, second highest market cap rune. And, I think the ultimate aim is to really become the number one Bitcoin meme coin. There's a lot of competition, but I think from a mechanics perspective, I'm pretty bullish on myself.
Always bet on yourself. That's the best bet you'll ever make. I won't ask you, because I know you can't really say anything about this PUPS specific next steps, but on the topic of just bridging the gap, crossing the chasm from ordinals type assets, runes, to centralized exchanges, like this has been, as you mentioned, like it's kind of like probably a giant wealth creation event if we see this happen. So obviously, like everyone's talking about this. Is this token going to get listed? Is that token going to get listed? Why has this exchange not done it yet? We've been begging them to. Why are tier one exchanges, in your view, why are they not? Why haven't they listed PUPS yet, or other runes tokens?
I think the answer is really simple. It comes down to the distribution of these tokens. Historically speaking, there is a pretty, I would say, substantial supply that remains held by a team or core contributors or large whales, which then drives some of the, I would say, backdoor types of discussions between market makers and centralized exchanges. So paying listing fees and working with market makers to ensure that they have adequate supply of the token that then can make its way to the centralized exchanges themselves. Now, the challenge with anything runes related is, one, these tokens at the highest level, so that I would say the top ones outside of PUPS, are really broadly distributed. And so you don't necessarily have any core contributors, so to speak. They're all just like, it's out there, do whatever you want with them. And the problem is the traditional kind of style of how to get an exchange listing still relies on having market makers to balance the book between all of the centralized exchanges that you have a listing on. And no exchange wants to fork up their own capital to ensure, in the case of like something like Binance, in most cases, they have demand for 3, 4, 5, up to 7% of the token supply sometimes. And so they don't necessarily want a negative outcome for their, core, I guess, group of users. They don't want this token to shoot up in value and suddenly everyone on chain has made money and their users did not make money. But if you just kind of follow the structure that they're comfortable with as a business, maybe it means listing fees. Maybe it means working with a market maker that then has a portion of the supply that they're able to fulfill the needs of those users. Then I think you look to be in a better spot. Is kind of the long story short. So fair launches are fantastic from an on-chain dynamic perspective, but when you start to get into the traditional ecosystems or the traditional centralized exchange listing opportunities, it does become a friction point. Now, they're not going to tell anybody this because they are kind of black boxes in how they list things. They don't necessarily want that to be public. It just, you can search it up online and suddenly there's just no dedicated resource to how to get your token listed. It's this black box of all black boxes of how this is done. And I think only those who have been in the industry or have successfully TGE'd a project know exactly the process. And it's a bit of a shame that there isn't necessarily, I would say, a standard process, but at the same time, like, I understand, because they would just have inbounds on inbounds on inbounds and people potentially gaming the mechanics of it to extract wealth from centralized exchange users. So a bit of a game theory around it.
So Arch Network, you're a big Arch bull. I think you've managed to turn a lot of people into Arch bulls. Arch testnet is live today. I think this is public, and anticipating that coming out soon. I had Matt on the show a few weeks ago. I anticipate having the CTO, Amin, on it. I think maybe before the end of the year, maybe January. I'm not going to ask you any technical questions, but what's your bullish Arch thesis? Why is Arch cool? Why is this an interesting concept?
I think, I'm not going to talk about price targets for Arch, but you can almost price it as an L2, or you can moon math it that it opens up smart contracts on Bitcoins, and then, it becomes suddenly the smart contract layer of Bitcoin, which, does that mean that it should be as valuable as Ethereum? I don't know. We can moon math it at any point. I think the long story short is Arch is cool. Matt's a great guy. I spent probably multiple weeks in the same room with him, just bouncing off some ideas along the way over the last year or so. I think Arch is really cool primarily because it focuses on a bridgeless architecture. And so from a taker's perspective, from a user's perspective, if all I want to do is buy runes or do any sort of purchasing activity and interaction on chain, I'm still actually using Bitcoin from an L1 transaction perspective. It's not until I'm a liquidity provider, from a borrow lend perspective, a marketplace, from an AMM perspective, an LP, that you're effectively in their side chain, so to speak, with its own consensus layer around it. So Arch is really cool because it's not EVM. It's like an adapted version of SVM with parallel execution. It also means that it can run very quickly if necessary to do so, which has, with the Saturn launch today, shown us that on testnet, you could basically do infinity TPS within the blocks themselves, which is pretty crazy. There are some repercussions on that if someone were to, let's just say, cancel their UTXO or send it elsewhere. You can do cancellations in multiple different ways. But then you have to pay the network fees of every single transaction after you, which actually makes it economically unfeasible to do so at scale. So, then there's very little, I would say, incentive for you to be a bad actor. But you can be. But I think it moves it from maybe, not 0 to 100, but definitely like a 0 to 1 improvement. And I think the existing architecture on testnet, and I saw a pretty interesting tweet from someone that mentioned this. It's like, whoa, this is not only better than what Ethereum has on their L1, but it comes pretty close to what it feels like to interact on an L2. So, how valuable that is to people is still a TBD, but I just love the fact that they're not trying to fight for Bitcoin TVL within a sidechain to build an ecosystem around DeFi activities. They're embracing the fact that there are Bitcoin assets, there are Bitcoin runes, there are other asset standards on Bitcoin like BRC20, and they're just trying to be the smart contract platform of choice for developers to build cool things so that we can do more on Bitcoin. Of course, it starts with trading meme coins. I think that's a proven product market fit. But then we have things like stable coins being able to happen on Bitcoin itself. We have the ability to do automated liquidations if set prices are hit and you're over levered on something like the Aave of Bitcoin built on Arch. And that actually means that Bitcoin can be very ETH-like. And I've had this view that, we're going to start to look more and more like ETH. We're probably not going to be as fast as Solana, but if we can become ETH, that's a pretty big value proposition. That means the desire to build on Bitcoin and having everything be priced in Bitcoin while users are holding Bitcoin, I think that's really like the ultimate win-win-win.
Yeah, you are, you may be an angel in Arch, but you're also one of the best marketing voices for it too. So
yeah, look, I mean, look, even if I told Matt this, like, even if I was not an angel into Arch, like, I think that this is really something, that I would support nonetheless. So obviously bag bias is a real thing, but I always try, despite bag bias, to be very objective from my point of view from a public facing perspective. And that can rub some teams off the wrong way, especially as some teams are like, hey, you're an angel investor in me. Like, why am I not getting the same amount of support? And I just kind of come back to them just like, I'll support, if there's something to support and if there's something cool to support. It's just a reflexive loop. Like, give me something to work with, give the people something, solve a problem, and I'll share the problem that you solved. Like, solve my problems. If you're not solving my problems, then you're not building anything.
I feel you. I guess let's my last topic then. If we're on the topic of solving problems, you came out to our conference in Boston, OpNext, a couple weeks ago, and I feel like first of all, thanks for coming. I would probably kind of like jumping in the absolute deepest end of Bitcoin technical discussion, and I'm kind of surprised at the range of folks who came. It was a small conference, but like I was very impressed by the representation from, I would say, the different types of like investors or speculators or people who have been looking in from the outside at this Bitcoin technical discussion and said, I want to now participate. So you were there. Given that I was barely able to follow everything still, what was your take on this conference and the window into Bitcoin technical discourse that you saw at OpNext, and where does that put your head on the current landscape of Bitcoin technical discussion?
Yeah, look, I appreciate you hosting OpNext. I think it was very valuable for me to be there, and I think that the participants themselves ranged from people that are traders and on-chain kind of curious to this generation of Bitcoin maximalists is kind of like where I slot in. In the past, I don't think I was as Bitcoin dominant. I just viewed Bitcoin as like this boring asset. I didn't actually hold any Bitcoin. I was just holding Ethereum primarily because I'm like, the smart contract things just makes more sense. So I'm a new generation Bitcoin maximalist, and I guess in some ways, because I really want to see this ecosystem thrive and really survive forever. But I think, where that put me, yes, you're right. Did I catch everything? Did I understand everything from a technical perspective? I think the answer is no, but at least it gave me perspective as how some of these decisions are made. And I think, for anyone that's very serious about this space, I think for me, I just let my curiosity lead me to where I think I should be. And I think being Bitcoin curious at the most central level, which is, core contributors, which is, activation forks and such, gives me a little bit more perspective on what can teams from a developer perspective anticipate coming next. Where should they be digging themselves as to be first movers in some of these things that are going to come, whether it's this year, next year, or the year after. And how quickly are they going to get these things? And I think the one question that I always had is, how close are we to something like OpCat? Because from a broad perspective, it does open up the avenue to near trustless Bitcoin on any other chain. It does open up the avenue for there to be a trustless wrapper of Bitcoin on every chain. I'd love to see that happen. But it also opens up the avenue for people to build scaling solutions with Bitcoin security in mind thereafter. I think there's a couple other opcodes that people would like OpZK Verify, CTV, and OpCat being kind of the big three, the I would call them like those are the Grail opcodes that would really amplify what we can do on Bitcoin. But I really wanted to know how these decisions are made, and I still don't have a very clear answer on how
nobody does.
And I think that was my takeaway is, okay, well, I expected there to be some sort of plan. Like, look, like this is how we did our last activation. Maybe we don't like it. And this is how we can do a process for any future activations. But the consensus that I got is there is no consensus in how these things should happen. So we should just be running around in circles and yelling at each other, and whoever eventually has the loudest voice to build the army around it. In this case, probably Udi and the Taproot Wizards team have the loudest voice to champion an opcode. And do I want to see that as the go forward state for every sort of Bitcoin activation? Do we need to have someone be this crazy hardcore champion every single time? I don't think so. But I also understand from a game theoretic perspective, Bitcoin shouldn't necessarily be changed very easily. We shouldn't be implementing risks into, the God's chosen asset, the Grail asset of all Grail assets, the perfect asset, the most pure crypto asset out there. So I understand the counter arguments to this, but as someone who is more on the let's give people things to do, let's build companies around Bitcoin, let's build applications on Bitcoin, I would have loved to see maybe a much more like progressive plan of like, okay, this is where we are. This is how we made some mistakes. Let's think about and design collectively in this group what a new process could look like. And unfortunately, there wasn't necessarily a panel with a speaker that came to that conclusion. It felt more like, no, you're wrong. No, you're right. Back and forth from one speaker to another. And I thought it was pretty comedic of a day as well. But an enlightening one.
I appreciate that. I think your takeaways are very similar to mine. If you hadn't been in Bitcoin before, and I don't think this is really known to many people, the fact that we got all of those people in the same room on the same day and for no fights to break out was notable in and of itself, because a year ago, these people would have never shown up to the same conference. So there is forward movement, and at least now we're arguing in circles as opposed to not talking at all. So maybe next year we could see some forward movement. I wrote I even just this past weekend, we saw a lot of coalescing around CTV, including FarmerJoe. Luke Dash Jr. officially explicitly said he's pro CTV. So who knows where we go after this, but it feels like we did get some agreement among some of the staunch, immovable voices in Bitcoin. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. FarmerJoe, thank you so much for coming on Bitcoin Season 2. You're like the most Bitcoin Season 2 investor and guy I can think of.
I am all in all aspects, whether it be Bitcoin meme coins, Bitcoin meme coins, Bitcoin meme coin founder, ordinals. I got my life on the line. If I'm wrong, then I look like the stupidest guy out there. But if I'm right, well, I might buy myself a house, much like you.
Yep, exactly. And on that note, thanks for coming to Bitcoin Season 2. Make sure to like and subscribe. See you all next week.